All right, and Dianara will let people in as they join. But welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our webinar series with the Bench with Bedside Initiative. And I'm really curious, I just want to make sure you all sort of know what the Bench with Bedside Initiative is and how it's linked to the Eileen McGeever breast cancer survivorship study. And so I'll just, give you a little bit, again, background, even if it's repetitive. So I'm Badur Salhia. I'm an associate professor at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine. And I started the Bench with Bedside initiative several years ago. It was pre-COVID. And the idea was to use this platform to recruit and engage women into our research study, specifically focused on breast cancer recurrence prediction using molecular markers in blood. And it's become a very successful platform in reaching out to women who might be interested, like yourselves, in participating in a research study. And we've been working on this research study to find these molecular markers in blood. And we're actually about to submit our first publication. So I don't see any people here from the first sort of cohort when we first started this, but they'll be excited to know that we're getting ready to submit our findings. And in another webinar, what I'll do is we'll present that data and let you know what our molecular markers of molecular residual disease looks like. And it's very exciting because what the purpose of the Eileen McGeever breast cancer survivorship study is to validate that in a prospective, study with 1,000 women who have had a history of breast cancer. But in addition to looking at these molecular markers in blood, we're also interested in just survivorship and all of the important other elements of survivorship. And so that's why all of you were very kind to answer all those, questions and all those surveys, because we want to look at other social determinants of health, environmental factors, nutrition, stress, psychological factors, and just how all of those might be interrelated in, impacting a woman's survivorship after breast cancer. And the women who are being enrolled have had breast cancer within a certain time frame. So there's a range. And the other important element is diversity in our cohort. And right now we are at about 75% non-Hispanic white women enrolled, and 25% a mix of other people and other races and backgrounds. And we are trying to actually increase that enrollment of underrepresented minorities, because we do believe that these biomarkers and this information should become meaningful to everybody. And so we just want to have a good representation from across the country, and to represent the US Census, basically. We don't want to over or underrepresent anybody. We just want to have equal representation according to the US Census. So we're doing pretty well in terms of getting some diversity in there, but we are trying to increase our efforts to enroll women who are from minority backgrounds. And Dr. Chanita Hughes-Halbert will, oh, there you are. Is that you?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Oh, you came in as Dianara. I was like, Dianara signing in twice. I'll introduce you in a minute, Chanita. Thank you for
Okay.
joining. Just giving everybody a quick update. But yeah, we are trying to really improve our efforts to enroll women of minority backgrounds. And so you'll see a bigger push in our social media campaigning to be able to do that. And right now, out of 1,000 women that we are hoping to enroll, we have over 500 women who have already enrolled into the study and are at various phases of the study. We are finishing up we're moving into, well, actually, no, we're finishing up year 2. So we're getting year 2 participants to come back and send us their yearly blood sample and redo the surveys, because we are interested in how these factors that we're measuring change over time. And we're enrolling from across the US and Canada. And this is the group here today is a good example of that. Chanita, you may have missed, but we have participants here from Wisconsin and Idaho and Chicago and California. And so that's very exciting to like look at our map. And so, yeah, so our next webinar is going to be July 13th, also at 10 a.m. And all of our webinars are recorded and posted online for you to be able to go back and watch, and also for others who couldn't make it today to go and watch them. And with that, I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, who is very kind to join us, Dr. Chanita Hughes-Halbert, who's a very well, she's a friend and a colleague, and really is an amazing person, and understands cancer equity and the issues with cancer equity probably better than anybody else I know. She serves as the Associate Director for Cancer Equity at the Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center. She's a nationally recognized leader in cancer prevention and minority health research. She truly has dedicated her career to reducing the disparities in cancer outcomes that affect patients from underrepresented communities, with a primary focus on African American communities. But among her many achievements, she has identified sociocultural, psychological, genetic, and environmental determinants of cancer health disparities, and translates this information into interventions to improve health equity among racially and ethnically diverse populations, as well as other medically underserved groups. And she is collaborator on the Eileen McGeever Breast Cancer Survivorship Program for all the reasons I just explained. Among her many contributions, Dr. Hughes-Halbert was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2017, which is an amazing achievement and honor. And she's also received the American Cancer Society Cancer Control Award in 2010. President Barack Obama appointed her to the National Cancer Institute's Board of Scientific Advisors in 2012, and she joined the National Advisory Council in 2014. So I can go on and on and on. And without further ado, I would like to basically have Dr. Hughes-Halbert take over. And I'm going to stop my share so you can share your screen. And yes, thank you so much for joining us this morning on a Saturday, and to all of you for being here as well.
Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Bodur, for the opportunity to spend some time with you all. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so what I want to talk about today is transdisciplinary collaborations in cancer health disparities research. And you just heard a really important overview and description of the work that's being done here at USC and across the country to address breast cancer disparities. And, you know, that is something where I think we all are focused in and have a lot of interest in seeing be mitigated. One of the things that I like to do in sort of talking about this topic is really just sort of setting the stage about what we mean by health disparities. And I think this is an important way to start because many years ago when I started my career, we really focused on disparities from the perspective of racial and ethnic background. And that is really important. That continues to be one of the primary ways in which we think about disparities, in which we understand disparities, in which we measure equity in terms of access to care and survivorship outcomes. But what I think is really important about where the field is now is that we really have a more expanded view and perspective about disparities, and we think about it in terms of religious background, socioeconomic status, any of the ways in which individuals, groups can experience disadvantage in a systematic way. So, you know, one of the things that I think is really helpful or has been important for me is that, when we think about geography, and as Bodor mentioned, this study is being conducted across the country. And so we're able to understand the ways in which geographic issues are associated with breast cancer outcomes using a bench to bedside approach. So it's really right on target. The other thing that I think is helpful to sort of think about as we sort of understand different approaches, and Dr. Salia is a basic scientist. I'm a behavioral scientist, and so what's important about transdisciplinary collaborations is that it really provides an opportunity for all types of expertise to be involved and engaged in the process of working to ensure equity in terms of disease risk and outcomes. And that's also important because of patients. You have the actual lived experience of going through diagnosis, treatment, recovery, and then long-term survivorship. And so this model that I'm showing you now is really meant to sort of illustrate the point that we all experience different drivers across multiple levels and across different domains of influence, and that to be effective in understanding the ways in which exposures within the environment influences the cancer, the process of cancer initiation, and then progression and response to disease happens within this broader social context. And this is a more recent model that I think is helpful to sort of illustrate the ways in which we can sort of show the pathway through which the how and where we live influences. So in this case, at the end, the primary outcome is where this work is focused is on breast cancer subtypes. And so, breast cancer subtypes ultimately, the most proximal thing is molecular changes that are due to epigenetic alterations and changes in gene expression. But all of those sort of molecular changes are due to and can be influenced by sort of where individuals live, the social political structures that influence our day-to-day lived experience, which then leads into our neighborhood environment, our individual responses to those environmental stressors, and then the physiological responses to those stressors through the HPA axis, and then behavioral behaviors related to food, diet, physical activity. So all of this to illustrate that, it's a complex set of interrelated variables, factors that contribute to cancer health disparities, using breast cancer subtype as an example. I think about this, and the way we kind of conceptualize it more broadly is within the scope of social determinants of health. And, this I think is really important because we're now at a point where we're really trying to understand the broader social environment, that's where and how we live, within the context of healthcare deliveries, within the context of the physical environment, and then also within the context of the healthcare delivery. So what patients receive at the bedside and the clinical spaces. That's really important because we now sort of begin having the language and the conversations around, well, how is it that patients who are experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation insecurity, how does that influence their ability to access care, their ability to complete treatment, and their longer term survivorship outcomes. So this is just an illustration, an example of some of the work that is being done. And this is a special issue that was published just 2 years ago now through work that was done through the National Cancer Policy Forum. So illustrating that, many entities, many groups are working sort of to bring this focus of social determinants of health into the scope of work. I think about food insecurity, transportation insecurity, housing insecurity as sort of some of the primary ways in which we can experience stress. I'm a psychologist by training. I do behavioral science research. And one of the things that we know as sort of a basic psychological principle is that, we tend to focus on sort of basic needs first, and then kind of which relate to food, clothing, housing, and shelter, and income. And all of those things, we kind of have to, those are the things that drive the quality of our lives, and and as shown here, access to care, and ultimately mental and physical health. So, the stress process, I think, is really important and an important way for us to think about sort of the social environment and the ways in which the places where we live, how we live, can influence cellular and genetic processes. And that's shown here, it's like physical health as one of the outcomes. I draw your attention to this because one of the things that we know from that this issue about stress and the stress process for diverse populations, particularly African American populations. We understand that segregation, neighborhood disadvantage has been a long-standing issue. So these are not new things that we're experiencing. I think the recognition of them and the importance of them within the context of cancer care and cancer risk is new, but this is really something that we've known for a long time. And now we, again, just have the mechanisms and the methods to be able to understand it. So this has really been an important turning point for me and for others. So we're, thinking about these in terms of several different priorities related to, within the context of basic behavioral science research. And so what I'm going to share with you a couple of examples of research that's been done to understand how different groups respond to stressors, both primarily from a physiological perspective, and then how these stress responses are due to their sort of lived experience and their neighborhood and characteristics. And then an area that I'd like for it to put into your thought process is like, how can we understand the ways in which differences in stress responses are associated with or reflective of the disparities that we see in cancer risk and outcomes among different populations. So again, this is, really building upon a huge, area of research where there's been studies that have looked at molecular biology and stress and breast cancer development. There have been animal studies which have looked at the ways and sort of isolated the biological pathways through which social factors such as social isolation leads to the development of mammary tumors. And this has been really important work because it helps to sort of set the stage and then translate that into human populations. So one example from my own research is shown here where, our goal was to understand the ways in which African American breast cancer survivors in particular respond to stress. And you can think about that, we don't sort of respond to stress, outside of our lived experiences and outside of being diagnosed and treated for
Shanita, we lost your sound.
the second sort of goal of the study is understand how these stress responses are associated with treatment compliance and adherence to recommendations for cancer control. So this is work that was done at my previous institution before I moved to California. But just to give you a sense of who we were focused on, these were African American breast cancer survivors who had completed their primary surgical treatment and had been diagnosed with early stage or locally advanced disease. We invited them to complete a social determinants survey where we asked questions about their background and their lived experiences, as well as ascertain information about their breast cancer diagnosis and treatment. They were invited following enrollment. They were invited to complete what we called a pre-challenge visit, where we collected basically vital statistics. And then those who completed the pre-challenge visit subsequently came back and did a laboratory-based stress test, where it's a method for activating the stress response, the physiological stress response. This sort of tells you kind of what that this is a validated approach and method for activating the stress response. And, one of the things that I think is, it's in doing it, sort of people have to do a math task and a verbal task. And, when I was reading about this approach, I was like, oh, this isn't really stressful. how can you do? I mean, I talk for a living. And so how can this be stressful? But one thing I'll just share with you is that, if you're asked to talk about this case is something like a random topic and, to talk about it for a period of time and, have people kind of looking at you a little bit with intensity. And it's like, it does really make you sort of feel like a little bit stressed. And, physiologically, does activate the stress response system. So our first sort of understanding from this work was just to understand, well, what are the characteristics? What are the sort of the baseline levels of stress, and this is hormonal stress levels, in our sample, without any exposure to a specific laboratory-based stressor. And so what this slide is showing you is that, the things that we think about as social determinants of health are associated with having a higher versus lower level of cortisol. And so specifically, not being married, having fewer years of education, and then having lower levels of household income were associated in this bivariate analysis where we looked at sort of the relationship with having high levels of cortisol, as well as having being socially isolated and reporting negative life events. And so when we looked at all these variables together, women who had a history of high blood pressure and those who had just a more negative life events, more cumulative negative life events, and that they reported were the two variables that were most associated with having high levels of cortisol at the pre-challenge visit. So why is this important to us? Why should we be interested in this? So one, it illustrates that the sort of overall lived experience and to the extent that breast cancer survivors are reporting having challenges with the legal system, having challenges with housing, having challenges with employment, is associated with high levels of cortisol. And cortisol, is one of those types of hormones where, too much is not a good thing. It's meant to be sort of keep our system in balance. And so what we having high levels of cortisol is some of the things that we want to be aware of within the context of breast cancer diagnosis and treatment. The next example I want to talk about is the work that we're doing and within the scope of minority men's health. And, this is, the work that we were doing within our breast cancer sample, again, sort of use a transdisciplinary approach because we brought in different types of expertise. So we had basic scientists, we had behavioral scientists, we had medical oncologists who were all kind of part of the team and shaping the research agenda, shaping the methods and working to interpret the data. And so this same approach is used as part of our work in prostate cancer. And I know we're focused on breast cancer as part of the Bench to Bedside initiative. But one of the things I'll say is that, I'd like to provide this as an example of a model for how we can begin thinking about issues related to cancer health disparities very comprehensively. First, starting with sort of the ways in which individuals are screened for cancer, the ways in which they undergo and respond to their diagnosis and treatment. So one of the things we learned through our work with prostate cancer is that men's experience of being diagnosed with prostate cancer, undergoing treatment for their prostate cancer, and then recovering and it's going into longer term survivorship is really, is pretty consistent between Black and white men. But what's interesting is that regardless of their racial background, what we found across all of our studies was that men sort of perceived stress, the extent to which they were not able to manage the day-to-day sort of things that come up in their lived experience were the things that were negatively associated with their quality of life and how they responded to their diagnosis. One of the things that I think and that really caused us to think about, well, what is it in the lived experience of men, and particularly Black men, because we know that Black men have the highest incidence of prostate cancer worldwide and continue to experience excess rates of morbidity and mortality from this disease. So thinking about the connection between stress and quality of life outcomes, stress and how men respond to diagnosis, it causes us to think about, well, what is it about the lived experience? And we know that African Americans and African American I'll share with you an example in just a moment, experience really unique stressors that I would also say are experienced similarly among Black women. We also know that social and psychological stressors impact the biological processes that are involved in the initiation and progression of disease. And one of the things that we can think about is, well, how can we understand that and capture that experience, that lived experience, in terms of a clinical biomarker that could be useful and integrated into cancer care delivery. So allostatic load is one of those types of biomarkers that reflects sort of the long-term exposure and the physiological consequences of being exposed to stress over a period of time. There have been several studies that have looked at allostatic load, and we know that there are significant racial differences, regardless of if we look at breast cancer populations, prostate cancer patients, individuals in the general sample who don't have a personal history of any type of cancer. So it is a very consistent and stable variable and factor. And so the question for us is, well, how do we understand the effects of allostatic load on cancer processes and outcomes more specifically? And that was sort of the driving consideration within the work that we did. And I'll take a moment just to illustrate a couple of examples of why we focused on this and sort of the stress and how I think the geographic variables are become important. So this center was also established in South Carolina at a time where men they were like, I think some of the early instances of police violence, specifically among African American men, that, just makes one sort of ask the question, what is it like for people to live under sort of the constant sort of oppressive nature of racism and discrimination. And so, that I think this was maybe in 2015, 2016, we saw these examples. And so the question is, well, and this is sort of drove our focus on stress, and then sort of raised a question about, well, how does psychosocial stress influence cellular stress responses? So you can see that, I quickly, because I'm not a basic scientist, I quickly became sort of my element from a discipline perspective, but really had great collaborators who brought expertise in biological mechanisms involved in genomic sciences and medical oncology to really launch 3 interrelated projects that all focused on understanding stress and stress responses from different perspectives. So the first project was around how it focused on men who were at increased risk for prostate cancer recurrence. And we asked them to complete our laboratory stress tests to understand how those stress responses influence immune responses to a prostate cancer vaccine. The second project was focused on understanding the tumor microenvironment within the context of allostatic load. And then the third project was a trial that was designed to understand the effects of vitamin D supplementation on molecular changes in the prostate. And what the other.
Vamos a comenzar ahora con los anuncios de la
Okay, let's see.
And so it was that study also incorporated allostatic load and the HPA axis variables, in addition to the social determinants, where we asked patients about their sort of how their socioeconomic stressors. We abstracted information from their clinical chart to understand disease-related stressors. And then we asked for participants to tell us about their perceptions of stress, social isolation, and other social drivers. So what did we find? So the first, I've mentioned geography a couple of times. And what I wanted to include what this chart is showing is that, one of the things we can do through collaboration, to our transdisciplinary collaborations, is really understand at a census level the extent to which there are sort of high levels of limited resources within the neighborhoods in which patients live. And so one of the ways we think about that is using a variable called social or area deprivation. And what this enables us to do is sort of provide at a very high level, using standardized methods, standardized variables, sort of the ways in which individuals are more or less likely to able to access things related to transportation, healthcare, and other resources that, are important for one's quality of life. So, what this is showing you is that, most patients lived in areas that had high levels of deprivation, and that there were racial differences and between our Black and white participants who lived in high levels of areas that had high levels of social deprivation. I don't think that was particularly surprising because it just reflects the distribution and the way, where and how individuals live, and in this case in South Carolina. The question is, well, what does it mean for us in terms of clinical care? And what this next slide is showing you is that the social deprivation is perhaps more important than one's self-identified racial background in terms of two important outcomes. One is their extent to which they enrolled in our particular study. And then the second is whether or not they activated their patient portal. And I think this is important because one, the part of this broader initiative is really about ensuring sufficient and adequate representation of breast cancer patients. And so, we are very interested in enrollment. And so the question is, what this data is showing us is that, is that there are many variables that are associated with the likelihood of enrolling in a study. But this was, I think, the first evidence to show that sort of the neighborhood and the characteristics of the neighborhood where individuals live is important to enrollment and a research protocol. Secondly, if you think about patient portal activation, and patient portals are one of the ways in which healthcare systems are developing systems and resources to ensure that patients are able to access their own health information, is the way patient portals are and a way in which patients can stay connected with their healthcare providers. So it's great that as you see here, that 66% of patients in our cohort activated their portal. But what is also important to acknowledge is that there were lower rates of patient portal activation among our African American patients. But then above and beyond, race, it was really, where men lived. And so men who lived in areas that had high levels of social deprivation were less likely to
Chanita, I think you cut out for a bit.
Chanita, you're frozen. I don't know if you can hear us.
the clinical space. So it's really trying to understand, and that underscores the importance of understanding where and how patients live, and social deprivation is one way of doing that. I mentioned structural racism, and so for us, the question that I think has been really important to understand is that, there are lots of different tools that are being developed to measure sort of structural racism in terms of segregation, in terms of lending patterns and other sort of census level characteristics. But to me, I think, the way in which we want to understand structural racism within a disease context is like how that affects how individuals live, how they live. And so we can think about that within, housing instability, unemployment, difficulty finding a job, violence, and legal issues. That is in some ways captured by the sort of census level variable of social deprivation. But we really have to ask patients to tell us about their lived experiences before we assume that if you live in an environment that has, this sort of characteristic, this levels of deprivation, that, people have resources, they're able to cope, we can be resilient. So we really do have to understand the social context and experience more directly. So we did that, and this was, from our work with breast cancer patients. We knew that we had a tool, we had a resource, a scale to measure negative life events. And what this slide is showing you is that in our sample of African American prostate cancer patients, 80% reported at least one negative life event. And that that it's having negative life events had a negative association with their quality of life, but was positively associated with their reports of social isolation, which I would say in this case is a risk factor for adverse outcomes, and also has a significant relationship with a physiological measure of stress response. So more negative life events, higher heart rates that will be reported. And then the final example that I want to share with you, and this is work that we're doing as part of this Bench to Bedside initiative, is understanding quality of life. And one of the things and ways in which we can think about that is how well are patients able to live their function in their day-to-day lives. And so a measure for that is an instrument that measures functional well-being. And what we found in looking at our first sort of discussion about this was that around if there are differences between Black and white patients in terms of their baseline levels of functional well-being, and we do see that there are significant differences between our two groups. But what's important here that I think is just understanding is that, we have to really to disentangle, race, the association between race and functional well-being. We really have to understand the clinical context, as reflected here by stage and prostate-specific antigen levels at diagnosis. And then we also have to understand how individuals respond to and sort of appraise their cancer diagnosis in terms of stress and their confidence and their ability to stress, which is the primary and secondary appraisal. And then the third is like their sort of lived experience with social isolation and perceived stress. And so let me walk you through this slide. So one is that we saw that African American patients had lower levels of functional well-being compared to the white patients in our study, but that African American patients also had lower levels of self-efficacy, the secondary appraisal, and also had greater levels of social isolation. Social isolation and self-efficacy were in turn related with functional well-being, as was perceptions of stress. And when we included all of these variables in our statistical model, we found that the relationship between race and functional well-being went away. It was eliminated, which suggests that these sort of are the social and psychological pathways to functional well-being in this particular cohort. So the question that you have to ask ourselves is how can we understand this within breast cancer patients? And I think, oftentimes we tend to focus on the disease characteristics, and this just illustrates the importance of understanding the lived experience, both in terms of how individuals and patients appraise and sort of perceive their cancer to be, the stress associated with their cancer diagnosis, the resources that they have to cope with it, and then sort of their general life circumstances. So in my mind, and I'm eager to have the conversation about this, is if we think about sort of our priorities for survivorship research as it relates to cancer health disparities, one of the things that I think has been really important and why I'm so excited to be part of this collaboration is that it gives us the opportunity to understand the effects of multi-level drivers on cancer health disparities. So if you think about functional well-being as just one specific example, we certainly have to understand the clinical characteristics, the basics, the biological mechanisms that lead to the initiation and progression of disease, but we also have to understand the lived experience. And so these types of partnerships really enable us to do that. One of the things that, how I got connected with this team was sort of contributing to how we thought about and how we measured social determinants of health as part of this, this particular focus on survivorship research. And then where I'm excited, and this is where Dr. Salia and I are sort of working together, is really to understand the interaction between these behavioral risk factors, social drivers, and biological mechanisms. And that's what your participation will enable us to do. So just a final shout out to the members of my team, who are making all this work possible. And I'd like to, open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was really amazing and hits a lot of important points like that are relevant to the work that we're doing, obviously, like you said, in this study and across the country, but also to the women who are on the call today because they're all participants of the study. And I just want to start by sort of calling something out that we've noticed actually in our study related to participation, specifically of African Americans. And we'll show this. And you mentioned this in the prostate cancer study where so we've been getting the reach, but what we are experiencing is that African Americans are more likely not to continue. So they'll see the ad, they'll engage with the ad, they'll even be eligible for the study. But then 50% of those African American women who are eligible do not continue with the study. And that's higher than any other group. Every other group is kind of like about balanced. And so I kind of want to get your thoughts on that. And for anybody else on the call, for the participants, Katrina, I see you're on the call. I'd love your kind of feedback and input on this, on how we can, improve that. We're changing our ads to maybe be a little bit to improve access or to improve the reach and the follow through. But I would love everybody's thoughts on this because I think it's an important problem to solve.
Yeah, I can start. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I'll share with you is, in our work with breast cancer survivors, we experienced something similar in our recruitment process. So, we were identifying patients from the from their post-surgical visit. So it was like an in-person recruitment, and then we sent a letter. We also had a strategy where we identified patients from using the electronic health record, and so we sent a letter, and it was we had very low response. It was like women just like, I'm not interested. I'm not interested at all. And so we paused for a moment and thought about, well, what could be happening, and then we went to there's a significant literature on recruiting cancer patients into clinical research. And so one of the things that we discovered is that one of the best practices, particularly for cancer patients, for African American cancer patients, is to provide information about the about why the study is relevant, particularly relevant to the group, information about the characteristics of the study team, and then sort of providing, within the appropriate sort of language and context of, what the benefits are, not just to, individual participants, but also to the broader community.
Okay.
So we did a complete, 360-degree turnaround in how we described the study, in our recruitment materials. And one of the things that we did as part of that was, we provided what we call evidential information about breast cancer in African American women. And so we sort of set this frame, it as a clinical and public health issue, that even though they're like, improvements in early detection, there are improvements in treatment, there's improvements in survivorship, that African American women continue to be in the lowest group that has in terms of survival. We also, our study was about stress and stress responses, and so that's not something that I think that people would naturally sort of draw the connection to. And so we helped to draw the linkage about why we were studying stress within this particular context. And then, we also, the last sort of thing that we did was provided information about our study team. And so, I wasn't excited about this, but, I agreed to it, which is like having, my picture, to kind of create some better relevance and to facilitate greater trust, I think, in the study team. And so that, from that, it turned our enrollment rates around completely. And our goal, just to illustrate, was, we were on track to meet our accrual goal of 120 women. But then COVID hit, and then we were just, things stopped.
Yeah.
And that was beyond our control. We couldn't do anything about it. So that to say, so a couple of key points. One is to, understand what, this has been a priority for many years within minority health and cancer health disparities research, recruitment and retention. There's a huge evidence base about what works, what doesn't work. And so I think, as you think about sort of where women are making a decision not to continue, there's studies that have looked at this sort of the sequence very precisely. And our own work, we looked at in one of our first studies, just sort of where eligible women, and this was a study where we were recruiting women who were at increased risk for hereditary breast cancer. We were starting with, well, where are women who meet that criteria, who have those sort of family history, most and least likely to be identified as like the first starting point. And so I think, you can, do and this is something that we can help you with our team, is just understanding the recruitment space and the literature about, because there's like there are discrete steps where you identify women, patients, where you identify those who are most likely to be eligible. And so then sort of, disentangling where women, where patients discontinue their participation. So, and there's interventions that can be implemented, strategies that can be implemented along each of the way, right? So we're finding that women are not continuing their participation. The question is, what is that due to? Is it because they're sort of confronted? One of the things we found in our breast cancer genetic study is that, women were having recurrence. And so like they were really focused on dealing with their cancer diagnosis and couldn't do anything else. And I think that's fair, that's reasonable. And so, but if you can think about, where and how, and that might be something that's happening here. So you can ask, you can do a little bit of more nuanced, more precise understanding of where and how people want to drop off. But that's why we're partnered together, because
Absolutely.
Day to day.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll talk more about that as well. I want to have make sure some of the other participants here today are able to ask questions. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Hughes-Halbert? Or comments or suggestions, or just any feedback about your experience so far in the program? I'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure Chanita would love to hear as well your thoughts or answer questions.
I greatly appreciate the chance to listen in to so many experts as part of this program. And the question I have, I live in Rhode Island. I grew up on the Massachusetts-Rhode Island border. And it's my understanding that this area has one of the highest rates of incidence of breast cancer in the country. And my guess, and this is just a historian kind of guess, is because it's the part of the country that was early industrialized, and there was a great deal of industrial pollution. I wonder if, I know that environmental factors are something that you pay attention to. Do you have a sense of that across the country?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So you're talking about like things in like the physical environment, which are like the pollutions and exposure to carcinogens, and that's really outside of the scope of my particular work. But what I will say is that that's an increasing focus at Norris. There's a team, I'm in the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences, and one of our divisions, for instance, is around environmental health. And so, they are, there's work now being directed to understanding the ways in which exposure to like exhaust from transportation issues, how close you live to highway, how, your exposure to this PFAS, and I apologize, I don't know what PFAS, the acronym stands for, but where and how that is contributes to the initiation, sort of changes in the cellular structure, changes in the cellular cycles. That's a growing focus of research, and I think it's one of the things that's been important to understand is where to have patients from different parts of the country who have different exposures. So here in California, as I understand it now, it's one of the most, there's multiple highways and residents, neighborhoods are built really close to highways. And they tend to be the neighborhoods, the more disadvantaged neighborhoods that are located in the closest proximity to the transportation, to the exhaust. Also because of the geographic characteristics of California itself, with it being like LA is actually in a valley surrounded by mountains, it's like things sort of calm, settle, and then it's like left up to the the climate, the weather processes to clear things out. So, I'm going to stop talking because I'm quickly becoming outside of my area of expertise. Other than say that understanding the ways in which our exposure to environmental, pollutants is something that, I think this team and at USC and Norris is really ideally positioned to do. And by enrolling women across the country, I think that'll just give some insight. And there's information about zip code, and so you're able to kind of make those connections, I think will be really important.
Yeah, and we're actually looking into, so there's geocoding, and we're doing that for the study, but we're also looking at other resources that have become available to understand zip codes across the country. I just want to say that I was completely forgetful, and I can't, like, badly forgetful to introduce Dayanara Ruiz. Dayanara, can you get your video? I'm so sorry. Dayanara is a really important part of this team, by the way. She is a graduate student with Dr. Lourdes Baez-Condes, and she's also a graduate student in my lab. We're kind of jointly mentoring her. She's very interested in patient outreach and community engagement, and we're so happy and lucky to have her on our team. She helps organize these webinars and get everything together. And actually, Dayanara, if you want to just say a few quick words. Again, I'm so sorry for not introducing you at the beginning, but definitely want to have a call out for you.
I'm very happy. Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. And I'm more than happy to be in the background sometimes. I love helping to put this together. And I'm a first year PhD student in the health behavior research program. And as Dr. Sathia said, I'm very interested in breast cancer research and looking at the community engagement side. So if there's ever anything that any of you as participants would love to see in these webinars, please feel free to send me a message. I can put my email in the chat, but we're always open to ideas, and we want to make these events what you want to see. So we always try to find something that we think would interest you, but if there's something you want to see, please let us know.
Thank you. Thank you, Dayanara. Thank you so much for joining us today. Are there any other questions? Do I see a hand up? I thought I saw a hand up. Oh, it looks like Chanita's joining in with her. Somehow she has Dayanara on her, I don't know how that happened, but on her profile, but now she's coming back on. Any other questions? I want to oh, yes, Ruth, please.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to just ask about the previous question about environmental and where you're located. Are these studies, do they look at the stress factor of different career paths and how that impacts health and the issues there?
Yeah,
There,
that's a great question. I can speak to that. I don't know that, there's been a focus specifically on like your type of employment. What I do know, there's some studies that have looked, among African American women and compared to white women, sort of the the ways in which, your education may not necessarily be associated with um, positive health outcomes. And so the thought process is that, women who are, and I think this can, kind of be generalizable to all women, you go to college, you get a, corporate job, you're working in the corporate space, but that's a kind of a stressful space for women for a lot of different reasons. And so, there are some studies which are now beginning to understand and explore, those relationships. I don't know that it's been the focus of, many studies. I'm just aware of one more recent work that came about in like the past 2 years, I think.
Well, the reason I asked that question is I'm the seventh of seven women in a family, no breast cancer at all. They live in the Midwest. I live in California. I work in a high stress real estate environment. They tend to be in more lower stress job situations. My husband worked at JPL. He died of lymphoma because I think he was constantly subjected to radiation and things working in the space industry in a parts department area. And to me, it just seems that there seems to be a correlation
yeah.
to stress and environmental factors and that sort of thing, a big correlation.
Yeah, I want to comment on that. There have been studies, I think the nurses study is one of them that showed, shift workers. It doesn't maybe explain your particular situation, but shift workers may have an increased incidence, especially women and people who work through the night. And that's because of circadian rhythm regulation. And there's a lot of research, including by several people at USC, who are really interested in circadian rhythm genes. So proteins that regulate our circadian rhythm. And if they're off, that can actually contribute to cancer initiation and progression. So there is something to that. And of course, also exposures like, mine workers and people who are exposed to potentially harmful chemicals through their job could be also at increased risk of cancer and various types. So I do think that the type of job that you do does have an impact. I don't know that it's completely worked out, but it would be one of those kind of environmental components. But the one where it's not so much your exposure, but actually the timing that you're working may actually contribute as well. And so I don't, have all the details on that, but definitely you can look it up and I'm sure you would get a lot of information.
I'm familiar with that. I work as a volunteer at one of the USC hospitals. And so I've been had access to some of that information on the circadian study. So
Yes.
I'll keep researching and it's an interesting field.
Yeah, there is something that recently showed up. It was an article that I read or something on the radio that I heard about Hispanic men who are like dropping dead. More recently that this is happening, and the reason that they think that this could be associated with some of the new I should say men who are working in construction, and specifically and home remodeling. And the reason is because now with these new stones, like engineered stones, this composite stones that people are using in their kitchens, the sawing of just that debris that gets released and breathed, it's apparently like causing a lot of problems. But I don't know that that's been well studied. It kind of seems like it's a new phenomenon that's being or should be explored, that's causing a high rate of higher rates of death among Hispanic men who are in this field of work. So definitely there's a connection. I mean, and it's like multifactorial, and it's different depending on the type of job.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the other information. Very, very interesting. 8-year survivor, doing great. So just keep giving us that information.
Congratulations. Glad to hear that.
Thank you.
And you know, there's a lot to talk about also in terms of enrollment of Hispanic Latinos. There's a sort of a separate sort of set of, you know, problems that we need to address when it comes to that, especially when we're trying to recruit from our county hospital. So not only are they minorities, but they're also underserved minorities. And so that poses a whole other sort of set of problems, even when you approach them directly. And so we can talk about that at a separate time. But those are things that we are really very committed to addressing and helping solve, and not just within this study, but at Norris at large. You know, very committed to minority research, underserved minorities specifically as well. And it's such an important topic. And I'd like to thank again Dr. Chanita Hughes-Halbert for joining us today. I think you might be heading out to ASCO soon in Chicago, which is ongoing right now. But if there are any other questions, we do keep this time slot open from 10 to 12. It doesn't always take up the full 2 hours, but we certainly want to have that time available to answer questions. So if there are any other questions, we're happy to take them. Otherwise, we can reconvene again in a month. Any final questions from anybody? Great. So thank you again for all your time and your participation. Chanita, thank you. Dayanara, thank you for joining us. And please have a wonderful and safe rest of your day and weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.